Picture a field so wide you can't see the end of it. Now picture that field covered in animals. Not a few, not a herd, millions. So many that the ground shakes when they move. So many that early travelers said it took 3 days just to ride past a single herd. That was the middle of America, less than 200 years ago. And you probably assume something wiped them out slowly. Disease, climate, bad luck. But that's not quite what happened. What actually happened took about 10 years. 10 years to erase tens of millions of animals from an entire continent. Historians have a name for it now. They call it an open-air slaughterhouse. And the strangest part isn't the killing. It's what almost nobody was doing with the bodies. Stay with me, because the real reason cuts a lot closer to home than you'd think. It's not really a story about buffalo. It's a story about appetite, yours included. Let's start with the number, because the number is the whole point. Before the 1800s, somewhere between 30 and 60 million buffalo lived on the plains. Scientists still argue over the exact figure, because nobody could count that high while standing in the middle of it. Some early accounts describe herds that blackened the horizon in every direction. Native nations across the plains built entire ways of life around this one animal. Food, shelter, tools, clothing, rope, even medicine. Nothing was wasted. A single buffalo could support a family for a season. So picture that number again, 30 to 60 million. Now here's the twist. By the early 1880s, that number had crashed to a few thousand. Not a few thousand per year. A few thousand left alive on the entire continent. Within one human lifetime, the buffalo went from being the most abundant large land animal on Earth to being nearly gone. And it didn't happen because people needed the meat. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. In the 1870s, a new tanning process was discovered in Europe. It turned tough buffalo hide into cheap, durable industrial leather. Leather for machine belts, leather for army boots, leather for coats. Back east and across the ocean, suddenly a buffalo hide wasn't just a hide, it was money. And demand for that leather exploded almost overnight. Professional hunting crews rolled onto the plains by train, armed with long-range rifles that could drop an animal from hundreds of yards away. A skilled shooter could kill over 100 buffalo in a single day without the herd even realizing what was happening. The hunters took the hide, sometimes the tongue, because it was considered a delicacy back east, and the rest, the meat, the organs, tens of thousands of pounds of it, they left where it fell. Travelers on the railroad described the ground littered with skinned carcasses for hundreds of miles, rotting in the sun. Bone collectors later followed behind, gathering the leftover skeletons to grind into fertilizer and sell by the ton. The animal that fed entire nations for centuries was being converted into belts and buttons, and the food value was treated as garbage. So why didn't anyone stop it? That's the next question, and it's darker than you'd expect, because some people in power didn't just allow the killing, they encouraged it. Military leaders in the West understood something brutal. The Plains nations depended on the buffalo for survival. Remove the buffalo, and you remove their ability to resist being pushed onto reservations. One government official even wrote at the time that peace with the Plains tribes was impossible as long as buffalo still roamed free. So the U.S. Army handed out free ammunition to hide hunters, not to feed soldiers, to speed up the killing. This wasn't only an economic accident. For at least part of it, the destruction of the buffalo was a deliberate strategy, a way to starve entire nations into submission without ever declaring open war on the people themselves. Imagine watching the animal your grandparents' grandparents relied on for everything disappear in a decade and knowing it wasn't nature doing it. It was policy. By 1883, professional hunters were struggling to find herds worth chasing. The slaughter had simply run out of targets. Just over a decade earlier, there had been tens of millions. Now there were pockets. Small, scattered, terrified groups hiding in the most remote corners of the West. In 1886, a scientist from the National Museum in Washington traveled to Montana specifically to find buffalo before they vanished for good, so at least a few specimens could be preserved for the future. His team searched the state that had once held some of the largest herds on the continent. They found about 24 animals total in the entire state. Across all of North America that year, researchers estimated barely over 1,000 buffalo remained alive, wild and captive combined. Out of 60 million. Sit with that ratio for a second. That's not decline. That's a blackout. But here's what's fascinating, and it's the part almost nobody expects. The animal that saved the buffalo from total extinction wasn't a law. It wasn't the same government that had armed the hunters. It was a handful of ordinary people who quietly refused to let the species disappear. Ranchers on the plains started rounding up stray calves and orphaned animals and raising them privately, almost as a hobby, years before anyone in government treated it as urgent. One of them was a taxidermist named William Hornaday, who had personally traveled west to collect buffalo specimens specimens for a museum exhibit because everyone assumed the animal would be extinct within a few years and someone needed a record of what it looked like. Standing in a field with almost no living buffalo left to find, something in him changed. He went back east and built an organization specifically to save what was left. A conservation society founded in 1905, decades after most people had already written the species off, and it worked. Slowly, painfully, but it worked. So what does that number look like today? Bison, which is the more accurate name for the animal and the one scientists actually use, now number in the hundreds of thousands across North America. That sounds like a recovery, and in one sense it is. But compare that to the 60 million that once existed, and you're looking at less than 1% of the original population, even after more than 100 years of protection. Most of today's bison live on ranches, not open plains. Genetic testing has even found that many carry small amounts of cattle DNA, a lasting fingerprint from the era when ranchers crossbred the last survivors with domestic cattle just to keep any bloodline alive at all. The wild, roaming megaherds that once defined an entire continent are gone, and they are not coming back. What survived is a shadow of what was erased, and this is where it stops being a story about the past. Because here's the uncomfortable mirror. The people pulling those triggers in the 1870s weren't monsters in some obvious cartoonish way. Most of them never saw the plains nations who depended on the herds. Most of them never thought about the food rotting on the ground behind them. They saw a hide, a price tag, a quota to fill before the train left. The animal itself, the actual living, breathing cost of what they were doing, was invisible to them. They were connected to the death, but completely disconnected from the meaning of it. And that gap between what we consume and what it actually costs hasn't closed. It's just moved. Every day you use products, wear clothes, eat meals, built on supply chains stretching across the world, chains you will never see the start of. Somewhere behind almost everything you touch is a process you don't witness, on a scale you don't picture, happening to something that once had a life you'll never think about. The buffalo didn't disappear because people were uniquely evil in the 1800s. They disappeared because distance makes destruction easy. Distance between the hunter and the hungry family who needed that meat. Distance between the trigger and the consequence. Distance between a leather belt in a factory and an animal bleeding out on a prairie 4 states away. That distance is what allowed 60 million animals to vanish in the time it takes a person to grow from childhood into adulthood. And that same distance is still built into almost everything you consume today. You are not the hunter, but you are almost certainly standing somewhere at the far end of a chain you've never traced back to its beginning. So the next time you see a buffalo, on a nickel, on a flag, in a nature documentary, remember what that image is actually covering up. It isn't a symbol of the wild American frontier. It's a warning label, a record of exactly how fast something can disappear once distance and demand line up in the same direction. The buffalo never chose any of this. They didn't decide to be worth more as leather than as life. But we do get a choice every single day about how far we're willing to look down the chain before we decide not to know. The plains have long since gone quiet. The question is whether we're paying any more attention now than the hunters were then.